Hey, welcome to 10X Your Team with Cam and Otis. We're a father-son leadership podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big ass problems. And some of those big ass problems, I don't know, they feel bigger than they are, you know. But boy, we can sure make them big. Like I'm looking out in the yard right now at the driveway and seeing chunks of ice and stressing about it. I'm like, damn it, why do I got to talk to Shelby today? Because I need to go out there and chip that ice off before it snows again. I get more ice. I don't think you have that problem in Arizona, do you, Cam?
Oh, sorry, you cut out there for a second, Dad. What was that?
I don't think you have that problem in Arizona with chipping off ice, do you?
No, we don't. But we got that. I found out that it is called the Pineapple Express rainstorm that hit California that is now coming our way. So we got rain for the next 5 days down here. And, to be a partner with you, Dad, I did look out and I was looking at the weeds and thinking about all the water they're going to get. So I'm going to have to chip away the weeds if that counts for anything.
Yep. It's going to be that day on our internet. So you still.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're just now back, Dad. Ooh.
Yeah. All right. I gotta love that. Good. Well, Pineapple Expresses and turning over the dirt. Good thing you got the garden all turned over with the manure. By
Yes,
the way,
sir.
was that cow manure or horse manure?
It's actually goat manure. It is a inherited pile of, to be technical here, hay and goat shit that is next to my shed out there. And so I just take a couple of shovelfuls of that and rotate into the soil.
Well,
Does it
there you
really
go.
matter?
Well,
You
Still
know,
no.
as the one who studied agricultural business, I should be able to answer that question, and I can't.
I know. I grew up on a farm, and I still can't answer that question. So, yeah,
It's all the good stuff.
it's all the good stuff.
well, and anytime you stir in shit to your garden, it's whatever
Gotta
kind.
be
I
good.
mean, yeah. We could put pureed, what was it? Pureed fish guts on it too, as our
I,
friend John used to do. Uh,
that
Your
is a great
coffee
thing to
grounds
put
too.
in.
yeah. So speaking of Shelby and growing up on the farm,
Yeah.
my good friend Shelby Jo Long, and I am resisting every little long ass Texas draw or fake British uh, language to use on that name because I'm a Peaky Blinders fan and Mr. Shelby.
Yeah. Me, as am I. As am I.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, so I imagine you might have heard that quite a bit, kind of like me growing up with Otis and hey, can we dance with your dates? Uh, for our older listeners out there, yes, Camden, that went right above your head.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
I'm completely
homework,
lost in that one. Do I get a quick explanation?
yeah, homework assignment. You need to watch Animal House this weekend.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
Which
is
it has
good homework. That's very, yes.
yes.
Yeah.
It has a cameo by Otis Day and the Knights. Let's
All right.
leave it at that. We don't want to spoil it. Make sure Miss Jess has a glass of wine. A glass is very full of wine because it's not really her type of show, right, Shelby?
Yeah.
Would you just guess that?
I think that's a pretty safe assumption. Yeah, that's pretty safe.
Yeah. And
Sounds
where I was going though before we went off on Animal House, which we could talk about that all day because there's a lot of metaphors there. But I wanted to get into Shelby on the farm, and since you didn't learn about the benefits of goat shit versus cow shit, what did you learn on the farm that has launched you into this business understanding and marketing world that you're now in?
That's an interesting question. I did learn we did not have goats, so that's why I can't make the comparison between the different types of manure that you can use on your agriculture. But I did grow up on a small farm in central Idaho. It was inherited through homesteaded by my Irish ancestors, and my my mom still lives on it today. And it's a small farm, about 2,000 acres. We ranched, and so we had cattle and sheep and pigs, and then we also farmed and worked the land and did all of that. And I have a lot of family members that are still in that. they don't farm anymore. We rent out most of the property, but it is still there. And, I've thought a lot about what I grew up with and how that influences what I do today. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is that farming, what it taught me a lot about, that in reflecting on it, even though I didn't really like it when I was growing up, when I had to get up in the morning and do chores before I went to school, or when I had to drive the grain truck in the summer and I had to buck hay bales in the summer, when I had to do all those things. I think there's a lot about discipline that's really important that you learn growing up as a farm kid, and then timing. You have to be, things happen in a certain schedule, and you have to do things in a certain way. And I think those two things were kind of a lifestyle that I grew up with that I think really translate over to entrepreneurship and hard work. I mean, there's not many people that are from a farm that are not hard workers, because it is hard work, and it's things you have to do, and you have to do at certain times of the year. So I think those are kind of the three things that I feel resonate in my life as an entrepreneur. And the more disciplined that you are, and the more that you stick to a schedule, and the more that you manage your time, I think those things are things that I learned that show up a little bit later, that you don't think about as lessons at that time. So if that,
we've talked on the show more about the work ethic, hard work on the farm, all those kind of things, and some other life lessons there. Timing is one that hasn't come up on the show before. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like as far as how that translates into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so the work ethic and all that, of course, ties into it too. But I think there's a schedule of things that need to happen, that you have to cultivate the land, you have to work the land, you have to plant seeds at a certain time. And I think that you're not going to see the results. Like, I always think of this in entrepreneurship too. You hear this from people in sales, like, what you do now reflects 90 days down the road. And I think there's that very much that same idea in the agricultural world, that what you do now, you maybe don't see the exact result of that now, but if you don't do it, you're going to recognize it 90 days down the road. So I think there's I don't know, I feel that that's important. And I feel it's a seasonal thing too. And that getting used to the seasons, and, like when you harvest, it's like 2 weeks of insanity, because you have 20-hour days, and it's that, but then there's kind of the downtime later. So I think there's very much about the seasons and the cycle, and very much about preparing. What you do today shows up later. So that's kind of where I would tie that. And I think the same thing happens in entrepreneurship. If you're marketing, or you're not reaching out, then you're not going to have clients, or you're going to have to rush. And so all of those things, I think, make such a difference that we don't think about. And I think that ties into the discipline idea of it too. So,
one of the things that's popping into my mind, and I know, Camden, I don't think you got involved in this when you were working on the farm, but your stepsisters did, and that is the whole farmers market piece of it. Did you get into? Did you do any of that, Shelby, where you were the drug along to the farmers market,
the sad-eyed teenager?
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Right. The forced sales things to do. We didn't. So I didn't really get into that, because but one thing that I did do, we're always involved with things on the farm, was I was in 4-H, and that was kind of that was what we did to be able, that was kind of a social thing that we did, but then that kind of taught the responsibility too, but never in the farmers market area. We were always in the bigger crops, like the wheat and the barley and peas and lentils and stuff like that. So no, I didn't. But the 4-H is kind of the thing where I could draw that connection too, because that's a lot of preparation. That's the, meetings and what have you, and preparing for the fair. And so there's that showcase that would happen, but that was always like the end of the summer and before we go into school. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, in 4-H, you still had to do the sales. I
absolutely,
mean,
absolutely.
you were
Yeah.
still pitching your critter or your vegetable or whatever, or your process. At least in my understanding, that was never 4-H. But there's still some great lessons, man. What a great organization that is
That's
to
where my
expect to learn.
speaking started, was in that organization. And then like I took a lamb in 4-H for a lot of years. You get the lamb when they're a baby, and then you train and you work with it, and I mean it's you're down there every day and you're making sure that they know how to be led and whatever. And then you grew. I mean, it's a very disciplined and very much into the timing thing. Like you have to do certain things to be able to prepare. And but then the big show is at the end of it. But there's a lot of speaking that's involved in that too. Like you give demonstration speeches, and you're in front of an audience. So that time, I will forever support that organization. I think it's great. So
How did you go from there on the farm to your kind of entrepreneurial route? You hinted at it a little bit that you got your first taste of speaking there. Could you talk a little bit about what that catalyst was that drove you that direction?
yeah, so my entrepreneur life is newer in the vast in the what I have done in the past. But where I went after high school is I went to college, of course, and then I got into what I did after that is then I continued in the academia, and I wanted to teach, and I wanted to, you know, communication was where I really was excited to be, and I really wanted to be in front of audiences. I like that. I did debate in high school. I was in youth government, did a lot of leadership pieces. And then when I went into college, I also wanted to continue that. So I did. And then after college, I wanted to continue that even more. So I got into coaching a college debate team. And then that got me into, well, I want to do this full time, so I need to be a professor of communication. So that's where my first career kind of developed, is that I went to school and I've been a college professor for the past 17 years. And I don't run a college debate program anymore because COVID kind of killed it. But I was traveling around the world with college debate teams, and I was on a national champion debate team here out of Montana, and then I continued to be in that space for 20 some odd years. And during that time, I wasn't really thinking entrepreneurship, but then I started to feel, probably about 5 years ago, I started to feel kind of limited in the classroom. And I loved what I taught. I liked I was teaching business communication and small group communication and leadership and all things human communication related in the classroom, which is empowering. But I felt like I needed to get out, and I felt like I needed to work with businesses. And that's when I started the exploration of like what that could look like, and started my and I consulted on and off with organizations, worked a lot in organizational culture and organizational leadership, and I worked on and off a lot with some local organizations as my time a full-time professor. And then I just made it into not so much of a side hustle anymore. Now it's my main hustle, and I don't teach anymore because I love being in the business environment. So that's where it started. But it does all come down to the main principles of communication, and that's what I do in my own business. And I still am speaking, and I still am working with businesses that want to transform their communication environment, have a better culture, reduce their conflict, very similar to what you all do, and just have taken everything from a classroom into the business world. So, but my entrepreneur life has been more recent. But I don't think you can, and my influences in being an entrepreneur, my parents were both entrepreneurs growing up, but they always encouraged me to be more in the, my dad was a farmer, local politician. My mom's a real estate agent. So they of course always encourage that I just continue and be with an organization, not necessarily in the world of entrepreneurship, but it's, yeah, that's kind of where the inspiration just kind of bit me. And then I met Jason Miller, and the rest is history. So There
Yeah,
you go.
we'll talk about the strategic advisor board. Know why?
Yeah.
Uh, there's a lot of puns there.
Yes.
In a minute, because I want to get to that. But one of the things you said, organizational culture
Yeah.
as a consultant. Just describe, because I've been diving into this myself, and I'm really interested in your perspective of how somebody says, "Hey, Shelby, my culture's all screwed up. Come fix it." Because I'm guessing that ain't what they say. So
No.
yeah, could you describe that? Kind of that. What's Bob's problem,
Yeah.
sort of thing, and then you go, "Well, I can do that. I can fix that, Mister Bob."
I had a conversation with my neighbor this morning that kind of highlights this, that part of an organization, that the people in the organization are great. She loves working there. The culture is great, but then the CEO, the CEO and founder and visionary, doesn't know how to lead. And so that's been, every part of the organization is great, but it's the CEO that doesn't know how to relate with people and is more of a micromanager, and that just tends to be the dark Charlie Brown rain cloud over the whole culture. And I think I would guess that many organizations deal with that, particularly that have their founders as the CEOs, because we as CEOs get into a vision of what we want, but then sometimes we don't consider on what happens on the outside. So, but fundamentally, I think my view of organizational culture comes down, and in the organizations I've worked with have been more of the state organizations, Big Sky Economic Development, Chamber of Commerce, that are promoting those types of things. But it fundamentally comes down to the internal communication structure in the organization. And if team members are empowered to be a part of the change and be a part of the conversations that are happening, if you're not in a dictatorship type of environment where you're getting direction and you have to follow directions, where it's more of my view of culture is more that the culture exists with the organization, not what you say, not what we say in the mission and vision and purpose statements of the culture. That there's a disconnect between what's happening with the employees and what's happening in the overhead. And the leaders that understand that, those are the leaders that I typically work with. It's the leaders that don't understand that the culture is different, that typically I don't. So anyway,
Yeah,
it's more of a kind of a grassroots view of culture. Culture is not just your mission, vision, core values. It is how those infiltrate throughout the organization and how the members of the organization feel about the purpose that they're working for. So
I'm
yeah,
curious. Talking. Go ahead, Dad.
yeah. I just wanted to add a quick thought on that, because I'm snickering over here because I get the same thing. It's the vice president or the director or whoever that goes, "Hey, Otis, come here, man. Could you coach my boss? Could you coach the CEO?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, sure, if he calls me." But it doesn't. If you don't know you have a problem, you can't fix it, right?
exactly.
And a subordinate, and I always love this, a subordinate pointing it out. That's in those sort of cultures, I guess you could say, environment, culture, that never works.
No,
It's like, hey,
it's
let's
almost that
just
the founder has to, the founder's not going to change, or the CEO is not going to change unless they discover that it's an issue themselves. So, and which is admitting some sort of fallibility or admitting some sort of weakness. And, it's, you could say you got to change because you're affecting the culture, but then they're not going to do it unless they see it themselves. So,
yeah,
The interesting thing there is, I think because it's like you can build in your systems to have the communication between people and have these dissenting opinions coming up, do those right things as a leader. But then there's still this, like, I guess, like positivity bias almost of when you're in a business, especially like in a startup culture, that it's like, if you bring anything negative up, then it's like, well, wait, you don't think you don't think we're not gonna make it? Like, come on, you don't think we could be millionaires? Come on, look at this businessman, look at this. Like, and it becomes this kind of thing where you get so caught up in the idea of it that you can't bring up that dissenting opinion. Could you talk a little bit about, because I think there's like the systems get people talking and those kind of things, but that's something a little bit more insidious of like trying to fight that bias that people will bring up those things that they are seeing.
And I think that's on and to give you a little bit more background of mine, I've been in college debate for a long time. So being a natural disruptor is kind of part of my whole thing. It's just part of my existence. And I think that makes me a better CEO and it makes me a better team member. And but I also think that that's rare. I think that especially with, we talk about people that are working in the organization, like just what you were talking about, Camden, that there's that, everything's perfect. We're going to be a $1 billion company. We're focused. We have this tunnel vision. It's this confirmation bias, right? That we have this vision where keep moving and dissenting opinions are not encouraged. But we as employees, or we as part of the culture, aren't necessarily encouraged to do that. And we don't really know how to be a part of that. So I think that's why I stuck with debate so long, because I think those skills are so necessary, particularly when you're running a business or you're working with people, is that yes, you can create the systems for that, but then you also have to teach people how to be involved with those types of things. And so they're not scared to be critical, isn't the right word, but they're not scared to question or play the devil's advocate, because I think that's such an important piece. It's called groupthink, right? So groupthink is where we don't question, or where our culture feels scared to question. And yes, sometimes that has to do with the organization, but also sometimes people need to be taught how to do that, because I worked in academia for a long time, so I don't think it's academia's fault, but I think it might be the school system's fault, right? Like, you get your answers right on a test, but that you work for the test, but then we don't question that. And so I don't know, I think it's a cultural bias, but I think it's a cultural issue too, because when people are working in those types of environments, they're not necessarily discouraged to question, but I think we feel uncomfortable with that. So
I'll agree with you 100%.
Interesting piece there of the ability to like paint the vision, have the team bought in on the vision, and then that this dissenting opinion somehow pokes a hole in that. That you almost have to be able to separate the two. Like, what's kind of coming to words for me is the micro macro, where it's like, yes, in the big picture, we are okay. We're going to be that $1 billion company. Like, it's all great. But then it's like down here in the micro, it's like, no, we got some problems we need to sort out to get to that point. Could you talk a little bit about like that, or maybe what the other thing that's coming to mind in that same vein is like you mentioned like being a natural disruptor. That's huge for a team. But if you were disrupting 24/7, then the team's not going to do anything. So it's like, you almost need like a controlled area for it.
You got to pick and choose your battles. Yeah. And that's being a team member. And we'll talk about the strategic advisor board, but there's 10 of us and we're all CEOs and we all have different opinions and different experiences. And, if you're constantly a natural disruptor, if you're constantly questioning, yes, that's important, but there's also you gotta pick and choose your right things, and doing that all the time. And being a natural disruptor is a quality that I think is admirable, only because maybe it's my quality, but it's something that I think is really important in an organization. But you don't have to disrupt everything. You got to pick and choose, and you're talking about the mission and the vision that are important. And I think that kind of goes back to the CEO. And yes, the mission and vision are important, the macro versus the micro level, but you get enough of that micro level conflict and micro level discussions and challenges, and that might start to eat away at the mission and vision, and the culture can be disrupted. So I think as a CEO, as a founder, it's important to be aware of that and to not succumb to confirmation bias and groupthink. But again, as Otis, as we talked about earlier, it's you've got to be open and willing to that, because that might, at least a CEO might feel that takes away from their credibility. So it's interesting.
So I got to ask this because, the debate kids in my schools, let's just say they fit in the lockers really well.
Yeah.
But
they do.
You said this, and I know you well enough that you're just saying it nice. People that are in the debate squad aren't natural disruptors. They're argumentative. True or false?
I would say that is probably 80% true. I'll put a qualifier on it. It's yes, and I think, and I will. Debate is a part of my identity. It's part of how I understand the world. It's part of It's part of who I am and how I make decisions. But I'm also a person in debate that participates in an activity that's outside of debate. Right? I think this is a problem in organizations, and I think this is an issue in communities that have their own communication style, that have their own way of understanding. It's okay to just be argumentative. That's okay in that space. But if I take all of those skills and put them in another space, then maybe that's not okay. And I think that's true. I mean, the same thing happens with like language and signals that we develop. Otis, you were in the military, right? So you know that if you don't know that certain type of language, if you don't know those signals, if you don't know that style of communication, it's going to be really hard to understand what's going on. But you also know that you can't use all of that language and all of those acronyms and all of that ways of understanding in every business, because not every business understands it. And I think that's, the debate kids fit inside the locker. Yeah, that happens. But it's that when we get stuck in that community and then we don't get outside of that community, I think that's I've taken those skills and adapted it outside of that. And I think that's a problem with you guys work in teams all the time, 10X your team. That happens when you get new people coming in all the time. They come in with different expectations. They come in with different experiences. They come in with different leadership styles, and that sometimes conflicts. And so there's a lot of negotiation on how to take those skills and put that into a new environment, and not assimilate necessarily, but at least figure out how to make things cohesive. So, yeah.
What's a like leadership lesson that you can kind of apply out from working with those types of folks? Like, I'm thinking like my background and Dad's similar also between military and then also rugby, of course, but it's like athletes, it's like high performers, competitive. So I can work very well with those kind of people. When I've been in situations where somebody's not competitive, it's harder for me to work with. Could you talk a little bit about like applying that? I don't want to just put it in the bucket of argumentative. You can take it where you want, but that type of person, and then knowing how to negotiate that in larger teams.
We'll just focus in on argumentation, or focus it on that because that's an easy reference point. But it also takes that self-awareness too, and to know. And I think as a team member, whether it be on the debate team or the strategic advisor board, or I'm working with Rogue Publishing, right? Like those are very different energies, and it takes that self-awareness, like my own self-awareness, that I have to adapt my communication to that place. And this is also gets into organizational culture, but that I have to adapt my awareness to what's going on. But then I also have to take those skills outside of that. I think it has self-awareness, I think, is the biggest thing. And then also the organization needs to be taught to adapt and move when there's new leadership. One of the organizations I'm working with, they have just gone through a leadership transition. They have a very strong leadership culture in their program or in their business. And they lost a leader and they replaced with a new leader. It was a transition. And the transitions are always tough because you get a new leader in there and there's different style. And the new leader isn't necessarily trained in being a leader. And so there's a lot of, it's constant learning, a constant learning environment and a constant adaptation, because the old leader is gone, and now you have to adapt to a new style, and this new leader is still learning how to lead. And so there's the self-awareness of where you're at and just kind of owning up to that, but then also preparing the other team members for that too. And I think that's a part of the responsibility of all of us to be able to do that. So if that answers your question. So it's okay to be argumentative. I just got to adapt that to the environment I'm in. So
there you go.
Yeah, I can. I'm visualizing a couple of situations.
Because you know who I work with.
Yeah. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I know very well. But what was coming to my mind is this transition that you've gone through, college professor. I mean, and you know I'm going to guess that you're not wearing the sport coat with the elbow patches and the glasses down on your nose, like that old image. But what everybody always pictures in that is that's the person who is the authoritative expert on everything. But you take that person, the Professor Shelby, and you put it over here into CEO Shelby. And that's a really different sort of feeling. Let me hear a lesson in that you gained in that step out of I'm the person, I'm the professor, so I'm always right, to the now I'm CEO, and it's like, all right, well, let's see, how do we do this?
Yeah, I have a good story about that, but before I get to that, I have never been the professor that's always right. I've always been the professor that encourages people to argue with me and encourages people to question me, because which is uncomfortable for a lot of kids per se, right? They're not taught to do that. And so I say, challenge me, question, whatever. Like, I'm not exactly right about everything. I do know a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that there's not other perspectives that question that. And so I've always
aren't you just pulling them into your strengths on that? Isn't that, come on, it's like Dad, like you challenging guys to arm wrestling in the college classroom. It's like yeah, you're just sucking them right where you want them, right?
But the skills that you learn when you do engage in that type of debate, or when you're talking about something, that those are skills that, even though it might be uncomfortable in the moment, those skills are what's going to translate later when you're actually in a business and you have to have those tough conversations. And so, yes, it is a little baiting, but it also is something that I think is all skill building. And so that's stepping into being, I think the biggest challenge for me in being in a classroom, going to being a CEO, and was that in a classroom, I'm given the kind of immediate rubber stamp. I'm running the class. You have my curriculum. You're reading the book that I tell you to read. I'm running the I do all the tests and the exams, and I'm the grade everything. And I'm the immediate authority and expert in that space. And even though I don't necessarily act like that, like my way's the highway, but then I step into a chamber meeting or a biz to biz meeting, and I introduce myself and say I'm a communication expert. It's a different way of showing that expertise. And I think the biggest challenge for me when that happened is that I discovered that it's much less about much less about me telling you what theory and background and whatever, and it's much more about, this is how it can help you. This is why it makes a difference in your organization. This is the ROI that you get if you think about, reducing conflict in your organization, rather than this is what it is and you should just know it because it's good to know, but here's the information and here's why it makes a difference to you. So I think that was, Otis, you can get me on stage and I could talk for, hours. And I loved speaking I like speaking. I like being the center of attention. Surprise. But I also know that I needed to make that connection of, here's this information, but here's why it really matters for you. And that's not something I needed to do in a college classroom, other than, like, why it mattered is that it might be on the test, right? And That's it. It's a
Is this going to
different.
be on the test?
It's a different. If it's a different reasoning inside that world. So yeah, that's I
I
think
think
was that was a big lesson that I learned. I was like, I can't do my 30-minute lectures anymore. People don't want to hear that. They want to know the basics and why it makes a difference for them. And they don't need to know the why. They need to know the how. So. And I think those are two different styles of education that I had to really negotiate, because it was I've been doing it for so long, and then I get into the business world, and then I've got to move and shift. So
yeah, because they don't want you to just lecture to them about all the the benefits, the why of this thing. They want to know, well, what do I get from it? What if I'm going to do this? What's the outcome? What's the results I get? Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about that in a number of ways, that things that I've been on the podium to teach and lecture about, not as a professor, but just in various aspects. That is a very, it seems subtle, but I think as the person who is doing the talking, that's a big shift, because here, let me educate you is one thing. And here, let me tell you what happens if you do this is another thing. Those are two very different things.
Two very different approaches. And I mean, Otis, you met a couple of the former students that now work with me, and that's that's such a gift for me, because I have the opportunity to like pick out the good ones in the classroom and be like, I like you. You know what you're thinking. You know that this is all going to make a difference when you get into the business world. But what an education for them this weekend is that they got to listen and they see the things I talk about in class and how they come into reality. But it's a different way of teaching them. So, and and with business owners, it's a totally different way of educating and empowering them to use that education. So, just very different. But that was the one thing I think that is the biggest difference between my role as a professor and my role as a business strategist are those two things.
I'm fully aware this might be a 15-minute answer, and Dad, you might hate me because we might not get to your questions, but you seem like the perfect person to ask this, Shelby, which is we talk about the intro of the show, solving big problems, making impact. A lot of people go to academia to do that because they can dive in and they can research this super specific thing, and they can go all the way through it, and they can solve this really small specific problem and then write this really complicated paper about it. It doesn't really do that much, even though they did solve the problem. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is like the entrepreneur who it's like, I want to build a business model that can continue to solve this problem in the future for people and help to spread it out to people, all that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on where's the best place to make an impact? Do we all need to go half academia, half entrepreneur? What are your thoughts there?
Geez, that's a big question. It might be 15 minutes. But I think similar to the transitioning role and communicating differently, and rather than giving information, I talk about why the information is important and why you need to do these things in your business. I think it's a good combination of both, but I think the most, the academic piece, which is the deep dive into one area, I think there are very big benefits to that as far as research is concerned and as far as the depth of knowledge is concerned. But the challenge with that, again, the benefit and there's the drawback to it, is that you don't necessarily see what's on the big picture of things, if that makes sense, or how that deep dive impacts the next research study. That's what I feel is so, and that's not true of all academia, but it feels very much a deep dive into one thing, but not a connection to anything else. And I think as an entrepreneur, if you take a deep dive into one thing, like your lead generation, and then you have so many leads that you can't fulfill them in your business, or if you take a deep dive into your social media marketing and you're not taking care of the leads that you already have, and you're not taking care of the business you already have, you've got to have a more comprehensive view of solving a problem or running a business than taking just that deep dive into something. And I think often, you know, I'm in marketing area a little bit too. It's like you've got to diversify how you're looking at things and how you're engaging ideas to be able, so you don't get trapped into spending thousands and thousands of dollars in digital marketing that might make a difference, right? Because that's what we're told, right? Like, you got to be on social media, you got to do all these things, you got to pay ads. That shit doesn't work for everybody, and particularly in the service industry, and like what you guys are doing, working one-on-one with organizations, working in teams, 10xing your team. It's not about those types of things. So I think I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I think there's a benefit to both, because yes, having the institutional knowledge that's really important is key, which is the deep dive, but then I think you need to put that into the bigger context of things too. But I think fundamentally where that can help draw that together is having a business mentor or a business team that is versed in all sorts of different perspectives that is very beneficial. So that's,
Yeah,
I think you need
one of
all
the
of
things
it.
that brings to mind is a conversation I heard once on the No Stupid Questions podcast with Angela Duckworth and Stephen Dubner, and they were talking about
I
how
love that
Stephen
podcast.
Dubner with Freakonomics has like kind of occupied this great space in the market, you know, to call it that, where it's like you have all of this information, like this ridiculous amount of information that 99.99% of us can't understand because it's too much economic lingo, and then he can kind of disseminate and send it out to folks. And then I think, kind of to your point, then on the other end of that then is the entrepreneurship, where it's like you can take those ideas and really start to run with them. So I guess I was going to make you pick one of where the impact was, but I guess they can all work together and we can all make an impact together. All right.
I listen to Freakonomics all the time. I think because I think that talks about some big things that we as solo business owners don't necessarily think of. And I think it's important to have all those views. So I listen to that all the time.
Well,
And it gets down, like, I'm a terrible multiple choice test taker. Terrible.
I'll wait until
because I argue every single thing. But anyway.
There we go. I'm back.
There we go.
All right, so
you get that, go.
My spin on this is, now that you've been a CEO business owner, how would you and what would you teach different back on the podium back at the university?
That's a good question. I would say, I mean, I've been teaching for a long time. I would say in the beginning, I would say my teaching changed, or it started to change and shift when I started my entrepreneurship journey. So when I started to get out and build my own business and make those relationships and make those connections, and particularly when I got more focused in the brand and brand strategy space, and building my own business and making those connections, and starting to understand failure and starting to understand that things are questioned, and that, you know, I didn't have experience in that space, even though I was building a business out of my genius and out of my expertise. I was not a genius in the business building space. And I think as I was on that journey, I recognized how everything that I teach needs to be much more applied outside of the classroom. And so I think it became I wish I would have started that sooner. You know, teaching I'll give you an example. I taught an interviewing class for a long time, professional communication interviewing class. And you could teach all the interviewing questions that you want and all the interviewing strategy that you want, but nothing is going to prepare you for an interview unless you actually do it. And so I made them conduct interviews, and I made my students participate in interviews, and I made them talk with business owners and people that do interviewing. And that started to make such a bigger impact with their education. So if I were to continue with education, I would make all of my classes much more experiential. And I put everybody in a business environment, everybody. And because I think that makes a big difference. So that, I think and I started to go that direction with the classes I was teaching, but, you know, now I'm in business, but but I would definitely do that, because I think the value of that is just incredible. So.
So
Because the theory is
before,
important, but it's not as important as how you engage that in your own communication style. So
Mhm. And I agree with you. I always think there's more value in the here's how I did this, here's how this was applied, sort of thing. You know, I've got a friend of mine who's been teaching part time at UCCS for a long time, but he's also a business owner. And I think those kids really get a lot better lessons on marketing, which is what he focuses on marketing than somebody who's, you know, been in academia for a long time that doesn't have the street sense of, you know, how do I take that principle and actually apply it into action, put it into real world action, you know. Uh, it reminds it unfortunately reminds me of something that we used to say in the Army that I just never liked. If this was a real situation, this is what I'd do. I usually just kick those guys out of the room when they tell me that, because it is a real situation. So,
I just want to add before you segue there, Dad. I was just going to say I remember I had a professor. It would have been somewhere upper level agricultural management type of class. I don't remember the exact one, but he said this, which I thought was really eye opening to academia. And this isn't just a shot at academia, of course, but he said that it's my job to get you knowledgeable enough that you could go to a company and they could teach you how to run their farm. It's not my job to teach you how to run a farm. It's my job to give you the tools to go run someone else's farm. And I think the balance there, from what you were talking about, Shelby, and Dad with Alex, I know who you're talking about, that it's you need that also, but it really helps to get that one real lesson of like, hey, here's what it actually looks like, so that you really know what you're getting out to, because that does so much to build your perspective as a student, I would think.
yeah, and just to
absolutely.
make sure Al gets his shout out. It's Al Ortiz. He's the owner of Cyber Software Distributors. So give Al a shout, y'all, and help out the small businessman in that giant business world of IT. You know, and it brings me back around to my thought on what did I learn, and it's actually a two-parted sort of thing because I get to cheat. It's not cheating when you own it. Uh, and that's 4-H. I've always loved 4-H. I was never a participant because, believe it or not, folks, I grew up in the city. Longed to be outside the city. Tried my best every time I could, but I was never in 4-H. Boy Scout, back when Boy Scouts were a good organization to be part of. But 4-H has survived it, and here's the part two of it is how do we get a 4-H thing in the city? Something that does that in the city. That's something that I throw that out there to the world to solve that problem because I ain't got nothing yet.
They have like a Business Professionals of America, BPA. Do you guys recognize that? Remember that? They have something
I
like
have
that.
not heard that one. There was one that Miss Suzanne was part of, and I can't think of. It was something youth, whatever. You know, they would make part of their thing. They would all have a project, and they'd make something. They'd physically make it and then sell it, kind of like a 4-H sort of thing.
Yeah.
Young business. Nah, hell, I have to ask her.
Small Business Leaders of America was something I was in. There's another one there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I thought you were talking specifically ag. I was thinking back to my Opportunities business plan. And I think I had a section in there about educating folks so that they can come and work on the farm for free and, you know, get community service hours and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
FFA. Yeah. FFA.
Yeah. But those are all farm related, right? So
yeah,
I'm
that's
talking
true.
I'm talking about the kids, you know, down the road that are living in apartment complexes that don't even have their own yard.
Yeah.
You know, it ain't a bad life. It's just a different life. But how do you get that? What is that? So, Camden, what'd you learn?
Yeah, you know, for me, I think it's interesting, kind of like an overarching theme of a lot of the conversation around leadership is that like self-awareness of, you know, who you are as a leader, who you work with, all those kind of things. But then the other piece of the transparency, you know, when we talked about the positivity bias and avoiding the negativity, you know, the confirmation bias, all those kind of things that it takes me back to another thing of the ability as a speaker, as a coach, teacher, whatever, to be able to say, like, I don't know, and be comfortable in that. Because the reason people don't like saying I don't know is because they think that the audience is going to turn on them as soon as they say that. If I tell my rugby boys at practice now I don't know the answer to something they ask me, well then shoot, they're going to think I'm a terrible coach and yada yada, and cue the negative spiral. But really, when you're fully aware of yourself, confident in yourself, and transparent with it, then if somebody comes up and starts poking holes in your business plan, it shouldn't make you feel insecure. You could say, look, I don't know about that piece, but I know what we're doing big picture. You can show them the macro, and you can say, look, on that specific piece, I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. We're going to get there together. So just how important that self-awareness and transparency piece is to leadership.
Shelby, how about you? What'd you learn?
Just talking through a few things, just talking through what happened with my neighbor this morning, and about how the founder, CEO of the company is so tunnel vision, and is a person that doesn't want to accept criticism or doesn't know that they need to. And just thinking about that, like, what are some ways that we as a society can encourage because I would assume, I don't know this, but I would assume there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are like that. And to how we can, and being in a community, an argumentative community, it's not all argumentative, but being in a community that maybe questions things, which is such an important thing. Like, how can we create my bigger question is, you all do this in your work too, but how can we create a society that is okay being questioned? And I think that's a real problem to solve, because I think that makes a big difference with companies' performance and culture and everything. So I think that's a big thing. And then it's always good to talk about the second thing. It's always good to think about how my life in agriculture, how that impacts my worldview. And I think that's, when I wrote my book a couple of years ago, then that really started to come out, as far as the discipline and the family values, and the really, business is like family. And I think that's an important thing to think about and remember, and that it's about relationships. And, you can piss off people in your family and they still are going to be in your family. And I think that's the same thing, especially with the strategic advisor board, is that yes, some of us might disagree, but that doesn't mean that we're not under the same mission. So it's always good to think about that and explore that more.
Awesome.
I think
folks
find you? I was going to jump on a rabbit hole there for a second, Dad. Sorry. Talking about how do you fix those things, I think it's really interesting, because part of me thinks that when you look at entrepreneurs specifically, it is more of a problem of how different the entrepreneur job is from the CEO job. Because entrepreneurs, to me, they might need that insecurity that makes them not great leaders. They might, whether it's that's where it started from and they kept going, right, or it's because everyone told them their business idea was terrible. It's kind of like if you said, you talk like a comedian and you're like, oh, they need to be, really self-aware and, down to earth and just kind. And they might not be a great comedian at that point. The things that make them broken might make them the best at that. I think there's something to be said there for entrepreneurs, but that's why you got to know when to hand off the keys to somebody else, I'd say.
Exactly. Yeah. Awesome.
Shelby, how do folks find you? Learn what you got going on, learn more about the Strategic Advisor Board.
Yeah, you can find me. My own website is shelbyjolong.com. It's pretty easy. I'm also on the Strategic Advisor Board website. And then I have Rogue Publishing Partners, is another company that I'm involved in. So you can find me there. Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm very active, LinkedIn and Facebook, so you can always find me there. And love to connect with people and help create better business. That's what we do.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you so much for your time today. It's great hanging out with you, as always.
What a treat. And Camden, so wonderful to get to know you more and to understand more about your background. I look forward to the next whiskey chat we can have, Otis and Camden.
The door's open for you.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Might take some coordination, though, if I'm going to drive up there for it. This is a little long.
Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to today's episode of 10X Your Team with Cam and Otis. And a special thanks to our guest, Shelby Jo Long, for joining us today. Remember, you can watch full episodes of the show on YouTube at 10x Your Team. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to pass along to other lifelong learners in your tribe so they can enjoy it too. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. As always, the full archive of episodes is available at www.10xyourteam.net. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.